Welcome to Football Nation once again. This is Cold Hard Football Facts. I'm Butch Stearns alongside with Kerry Byrne, the potentate of pigskin.
I'm glad you finally mastered my title, Butch.
It took taking me a year to get that out. Let's talk about LaDainian Tomlinson. He's retiring after a long, storied career, and let me use my adjectives. A durable guy, a home run hitter, and as good a running back as the NFL has ever seen.
He's on the very short list. I don't know if you can make the argument that he's the best of all time. I think there's a number of guys I'd put ahead of LT, but a brilliant career, great numbers that could stand the test of time. 5th all-time in rushing yards, 5th all-time in yards from scrimmage. Had some amazing seasons. 2003 season, the only guy running back in history to rush for over 1,000 yards and catch 100 passes in the same season, and he was an MVP. It went to Peyton Manning.
Well, it's remarkable because, as you mentioned, there was only one other guy who caught 100 passes as a running back in a season, and that was Larry Sanders, and he didn't run the ball.
He ran the ball like 75 times all year. So when you look at those numbers, specifically from 2003, 2006 his MVP season, he was again incredible. Chargers had probably their best team of all time, 14-2, most points scored in franchise history. Really a great, great player. But if you're going to talk about the perfect back, there were a couple flaws in his game.
All right, and you got the numbers to back it up. That's what you're all about, cold, hard football facts. But let's stay on the general part for a second. The numbers you mentioned, 13,684 yards, 5th all-time. I mean, this is pretty heady company. Only Emmitt Smith, Walter Payton, Barry Sanders, and Curtis Martin have rushed for more yards in the history of the NFL. 3rd in touchdowns. Only Jerry Rice and Emmitt Smith with more than his 162 touchdowns. And remarkably, Terrell Owens and Randy Moss are right behind him. If they're still going to play, who knows, and going to add to those numbers. But when it comes to touchdowns and rushing yards, he was a machine.
He was absolutely a machine, and the amazing thing is he did most of it at a very young age. I mean, he came out of Texas Christian as a junior, and he was, and we'll get into a little bit more about this later, but he was essentially washed up by 30. I know people don't like to hear that. He turns 33 on June 23rd. He's retired at 32. It's a young man's game, Butch.
Well, as we talk with Kerry Byrne and we get into the cold, hard football facts and back the numbers up, and we're talking about LaDainian Tomlinson, you make the case that there are really 3 different sides to LaDainian Tomlinson. There's the regular season and the postseason, and then there's the post-29-year-old LaDainian Tomlinson. And the numbers tell a different story about how dominant he actually was when the games were on the line or late in his career, right?
And exactly. I mean, just look at his, 47 100-yard games in his career in the regular season. 1 in the postseason and 10 chances. That's not a great track record for an elite player to rush for 100 yards. And that came at a loss against the Patriots, that 14-2 Chargers team we talked about. Didn't even win a playoff game. That was his lone. I think he had 123 yards that game. Averaged 4.3 yards per attempt in the regular season, 3.6 in the postseason. You go down, 162 touchdowns in his career in the regular season, 7 in the postseason. I mean, he was scoring almost a touchdown per game in his career in the regular season. And then, could barely get in the end zone, rushing or receiving in the postseason. And there's those kind of famous images of him sitting on the sidelines and what was it, the 2007 AFC title game with his visor on. Was he injured? Was he not? I don't want to blame, it's not all an LT thing. Running backs can be shut down. That's why they're not as valuable as quarterbacks. You can take a running back out of the game, and clearly LT was taken out of the game time and again in the postseason.
Well, and clearly if you're defending the San Diego Chargers, you're starting with him.
Yeah, and so they can be, look at even Jim Brown, the greatest running back of all time. I think that's without dispute, Butch. He had some really bad playoff games. The reason why he only won 1 championship, a lot of times those great Browns teams didn't even make the postseason with the best running back of all time. And when they did, he had some bad games. He won 1 championship in 9 years. Even the best running backs could be taken out of the game. So part of it is the reality of the situation, the cold, hard football facts, that he did not play as well in the postseason as he did in the regular season. But if some of that is just the nature of the game, you can take out those great running backs. That's why teams that rely on their running backs too much are almost always doomed to failure. We talk about this over and over at Cold Hard Football Facts. It's a quarterbacks league, and the running backs are most overvalued. And the LT example could be great player, Hall of Famer, but could be an example of a guy who was overvalued and couldn't come through when the postseason was there.
Let's look at the post-29-year-old or 30-year-old and over LT. Now, I would argue, as you're going to go through these numbers, clearly they're going to prove that later in his career he diminished. Don't all running backs do that?
All running backs definitely do. So this is more an example to show that it's a young man's game, Butch. We know that. By the way, Butch, all these numbers will be up on SI.com. His example is just pretty dramatic, that he was unstoppable to age 29 and then couldn't really do much at age 30. 8 seasons in his 20s, he ran for 1,000 yards every season. 3 seasons in his 30s, didn't run for 1,000 yards once. almost 18 touchdowns per season in his 20s, 7 touchdowns per season in his 30s, go number by stat. He just fell off the face of the earth when he reached his 30s. And that's the case, yes, that is the case, Butch, with all running backs. It's a young man's game, but his is so distinct, so dramatic that he became a different player when he reached that age. And, you know, he's out of football at age 32.
Let's look at some of the other numbers that you looked up that sort of are interesting when you look at it. Here's one I find interesting. For a guy that's 5th on the all-time list in rushing yards, again, behind Emmitt Smith, Walter Payton, Barry Sanders, Curtis Martin, he only led the NFL in rushing 3 times, rushing TDs 3 times.
Yep, and rushing yards twice. But that's still pretty impressive for, you know, for a short career. That's a pretty good rate. You know, a lot of players never, you know, a lot of great players never led the NFL in rushing. We still consider them Hall of Famers. My favorite, this is my favorite LT Cold Hard Football fact, Butch. 146.9 career passer rating. He went 8 for 12 with 7 touchdowns, throwing the ball, you know, always on gimmick plays, right? But what great numbers. We said, eat your heart out, Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady and Peyton Manning. That's a fantastic performance.
And the other number that's interesting is that the number of starts that he missed in his career in a decade, from 01 to 2010, was 6.
Yeah,
that's remarkable.
And most of those later on in his career, you know, in his 20s, I think he missed 1 or 2 games in his 20s in his first 8 years. It's pretty dramatic. He was a great Iron Man. He didn't look like the biggest guy out there, but he was, you know, he was a ball of muscle. He was a great player. And just when you play that position and barely miss a game, that's amazing. And what he proves to me, and we talked about this in SI, it shows more and more every year that Jim Brown had it right. Jim Brown walked off the field at age 29, at the height of his game, led the NFL in rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, said, I'm done, never played again, and he's forever young, forever dominant in our minds. I'm not saying LT should have done that. I'm just saying maybe Jim Brown knew something in 1965 that some players today don't know.
There is no debate that LaDainian Tomlinson is one of the greatest running backs in the history of the NFL. But when you look closer at the numbers, the cold hard football facts numbers, it paints a picture that there were some flaws even in a player that great's game. I'm Butch Stearns. He's Kerry Byrne for Football Nation. This is Cold Hard Football Facts.